Right in front of you is an iMac from 2009, once considered Apple's so-called $1,000 machine. But inside, the GPU only has 256 megabytes of VRAM. With such a tiny amount of VRAM, the big question is, can it still play any games today? So today, we're going to put this iMac to the test, running a series of games on just 256 megabytes of VRAM. Let's get started. This is the iMac I borrowed from a friend. It was manufactured in 2009, which means it's now about 17 years old. Back then, this was a very clean and all-in-one machine, especially when most PCs were still large towers with messy cables everywhere. Now, to be clear, this iMac isn't small at all, especially the 27-inch version. But compared to traditional PCs at the time, everything was built into one single unit, which made it look much cleaner and more premium. In 2009, Apple released 3 versions of the iMac: iMac Early, iMac Mid, and iMac Late. Among these, the iMac Late was the highest-end model. It also marked the final peak of the old generation iMac before Apple fully transitioned into the thinner and lighter designs later on. And that's exactly the one I have here, the 27-inch iMac. Now let's power it on and see what kind of hardware is inside. This machine already has a Windows installation set up by my friend, and the reason for that is pretty simple. macOS is no longer supported on this system in terms of security features and many popular applications. The boot time is quite slow, which is expected considering how old the hardware is. But what really surprised me here is the display quality. This screen has a resolution of 1920 by 1200, and honestly, that's very impressive for a machine from 2009. From what I remember, most monitors back then were still running at HD resolution. This really shows how well Apple handled hardware technology, especially when it comes to displays. Now, as for the CPU, this machine is running a Core 2 Duo E8,335. It's a dual-core, dual-thread processor with a clock speed of 2.93 GHz. But the part I'm most interested in here is the GPU. This iMac is using a GeForce GT 120, paired with just 256 megabytes of RAM, which is an extremely low amount. This is probably the weakest GPU I've ever used, and it might even be weaker than the GT 210 I tested before. So let's take a closer look at this graphics card. The GT 120 was released around 2009, right around the same time as the early iMac models. From what I've found, the GT 120 is actually a rebranded version of the GeForce 9500 GT, specially commissioned by Apple. It uses DDR3 memory and only supports DirectX 10, which already tells you that this GPU was never designed for gaming in the first place. The GT 120 is also one of the very few NVIDIA GPUs with Apple EFI, and it was widely used by Apple across iMac and Mac Pro systems from 2009 to 2012. Back then, Apple clearly favored NVIDIA for its graphics solutions, before eventually shifting away and closing the NVIDIA era on Mac altogether. Architecturally, the NVIDIA GeForce GT 120 is based on the G96 core, part of NVIDIA's Tesla architecture, built on a 65-nanometer process. It features 32 CUDA cores and a 128-bit memory interface, which is enough for basic display output, operating system UI, OpenGL tasks, and compositing in macOS. Because of that, the GT120 was positioned as a display and 2D graphics GPU for workstations, not a gaming card. While its raw performance wasn't impressive compared to PC GPUs of the same era, its stability, macOS compatibility, and Apple EFI support were the main reasons Apple chose the GT120 for its systems. The RX 580 can struggle in certain esports titles. Oh no. The GT 120 is actually about 6 times more powerful than the GT 210. From what I know, these two GPUs were released around the same time and aimed at the same market segment. But the difference is this: one of them was bundled by Apple with Mac Pro systems, while the other showed up everywhere in Office PCs. Even though the GT 210 was released later, it was heavily cut down. And that's exactly why it ends up being weaker than the GT120. The GT210 was a GPU specifically designed by NVIDIA for office machines, so a lot of the hardware was stripped away to keep costs and power consumption low. And this is where I learned an important lesson from GPU name. The name alone doesn't define how powerful a graphics card really is. Now I'm going to start gaming on the GT120 to see how it actually handles games. I'll begin with Crysis, a game that was released 2 years before this iMac. It came out in 2007 and was considered a legendary benchmark game back then. I'll start at 720p with low settings. At this configuration, the FPS sits around 40 to 50. However, the CPU is almost fully loaded while the GPU is running at about 80% usage and using nearly 250 megabytes of VRAM. Even though the biggest limitation here is the 256 megabytes VRAM, the frame rate is actually stable and smooth. Next, I push the settings up to 1080p. At this point, both the CPU and GPU are working at nearly 100%. The FPS drops to around 20 to 30, but surprisingly, the overall experience is still fairly smooth. Next, let's move on to Left 4 Dead, a game released in 2008, which means it actually came out 1 year before the GT120. I'm playing at 1080p on low settings. At this point, the FPS stays at just over 30. The GT120 is running at around 96% usage. What's really impressive here is that even during heavy zombie fights with lots of effects, the experience stays smooth and there are no noticeable frame drops. For this game, the GT120 is only using about 198 megabytes of RAM. Next up is Minecraft. I'm playing at 1080p with an 8-chunk render distance. At this setting, the FPS sits around 40, but frame drops happen constantly, mainly because the CPU is running at full load. The GPU also isn't very stable here, and VRAM usage sits at around 246 megabytes. So now I'm going to drop the resolution down to 720p, hoping for a smoother experience. While the FPS does improve, there are still minor frame drops showing up from time to time. Next, I move on to Far Cry 3. For this game, I'm running it at 720p on low settings. At this configuration, the FPS hovers around 15 frames per second. To reach this level of performance, both the CPU and GPU are running almost at full load. Even so, the overall experience is still fairly smooth and consistent. Now let's switch to a more modern shooter, which is CSGO. For this one, I'm playing at 720p on low settings. The FPS ranges between 20 and 30. However, the GT120 is using almost the full 256 megabytes of VRAM. For a shooter like this, around 30 FPS doesn't feel especially smooth, but still I have to give some credit to this GPU. Next, I'm going to test GTA 5. I'm running the game at 720p on low settings. With this setup, the FPS is extremely low, under 10 frames per second. The frame rate drops constantly, making the experience very uncomfortable. This is probably the limit of the GT120 and really the limit of this entire system. And finally, I'm going to test a more modern title, Tomb Raider. I'll be running it at 720p on low settings. Right from the moment the game starts, the system is operating at nearly 100% load. Even so, the FPS comes in at around 34 frames per second, and the frame pacing is very stable, with no noticeable drops. What's really surprising here is that for a AAA game like Tomb Raider, the GT120 is only using about 233 megabytes of RAM. Overall, I honestly didn't expect this system to handle Tomb Raider this well. And that's everything about this iMac and its 256 megabytes VRAM GPU. What impressed me the most about this iMac is the display quality and resolution. Even though it was released back in 2009, Apple clearly invested heavily in hardware quality at the time. As for the GT120, despite its very limited amount of VRAM, it's still able to handle certain games smoothly when you use the right settings. While it was never designed for gaming, it actually performs very well within the role it was meant to fill. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos.